Hello, everyone, and welcome to WooStream, where we're bringing the Willamette community together. I'm Eric Lasan, and for today's conversation, we're joined by Dr. Peter McGraw. Pete is a behavioral economist, sought-after professional speaker, and global expert in the scientific study of humor. He directs the Humor Research Lab, or HuRL, hosts the podcast I'm Not Joking, and is the co-author of The Humor Code, a global search for what makes things funny. McGraw is a professor of marketing and psychology at the University of Colorado's Leeds School of Business. He teaches MBA courses for the University of Colorado Boulder, University of California, San Diego, and London Business School. His work has been covered by BBC, CNN, NPR, Wired, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Harvard Business Review. His forthcoming book launched yesterday, April Fool's Day, 2020. It's called Shtick to Business, What the Masters of Comedy Can Teach You About Breaking the Rules, Being Fearless, and Building a Serious Career. Welcome, Pete McGraw.
Welcome, as I like to say, EL, or Calasan.
So there it is. Let's start off with the fact that we're friends. We go back a ways. And as I read your books and listen to your podcasts, you know, we've had a lot of great conversations over the years, and I used to think that that was something that was about us, and then I've come to realize it's actually you, and I've just been along for the ride when we've had these really great conversations.
That's hardly the case. Well, I guess we'll know by the end of WooStream whether, which is true. I think you bring 51% to those.
No, we'll haggle over that later. But the other thing I'd like, I think it's important to mention as we get into this is that we are in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and many of us, if not most of us, are sheltered in place and working remotely, et cetera. You've actually chosen not to shelter in place, but shelter in a different place. Maybe talk a little bit about you're a creature of habit. You love your routines, and kind of you've been living in LA, and all your routines kind of were taken away from you. So tell you now you're in the desert, I think. So tell us about that.
I'm in Joshua Tree right now. I actually a friend of mine. I said, I think I'm heading to the desert. And she says, you're from another planet. And so I think I find myself, I am a creature of habit. I do like my rituals, my routines. There's a saying in the book from Scott Adams, the creator of Dilbert, which is don't have goals, have systems. And I really like that idea of having systems. Well, all the things that facilitate my systems went away. Right. And rather than just be stuck in my box in the sky, I decided to make the 2-hour drive out, and I'm renting a lovely little sort of cabin cottage in the desert. So I'm on sabbatical now, but I'm truly on sabbatical. And I think this is a nice example of some of the ideas that I have in the book, which is about thinking differently. And so I'm sure we'll get to those, but I will let you lead, my friend.
All right. Well, I think a common theme, of your work is not only, the intersection of humor and business, but also one of the things that always bubbles up for me when I'm reading your work or hearing you talk in your podcast is the practice of living a remarkable life. And I feel like you've kind of gotten that down to a science, given the fact that you really are a scientist in that respect. So maybe just that might also be another kind of overview or maybe one of the big takeaways from today's conversation.
Sure. Let's so yeah, I would say this, I can't believe that my life has turned out the way it's turned out. So for the listeners, I got to know Eric more than 20 years ago, now getting closer to 25 years ago. What? I would say. Certainly, yeah. That's good. In between. And I was sort of living a kind of normal sort of student affairs-y life at that time. I was managing a residence hall. I had aspirations to go off and become an academic, to get a PhD, which I was successful in, and then was living kind of the more or less normal life of an academic, probably a little bit more social than average, and didn't think that much of it. I did my share of traveling. That was probably the most, I think, stretching kind of activities that I did. And then I ended up sort of stumbling on this question of what makes things funny, and it just knocked me, completely off track and into a place where I think my life has become sort of, if I may be, immodest, uh, more interesting than average. And so now that I'm living it, I'm like, oh, how far can I take this thing? And so here we are.
It's really been fun to see you stretch out and see what that trajectory is going to look like. It's been fun to check in with you and to see your work progress and evolve. So maybe, I imagine that your kind of overall philosophy on living a remarkable life will reveal itself further as we talk about some more specifically about some of your work.
I will say this: there is this idea of this term of remarkable life is a new term. It used to be I used to want to live an interesting life, and I think a little bit of this. I've really been focused a lot. I think the pandemic has. It's impossible for us to ignore that as we have this conversation, and so I find myself using this Confucius quote a lot lately. It came up in one of my podcasts, and it's, I'm going to butcher it, but it goes something like this: "Is we live two lives, and the second one begins when we realize we have one life." And I think that I had personally had some things happen early on in my life as a younger man that made me realize the sort of impermanence of life. I think a lot of people are sort of recognizing the impermanence of life, or at least the things that we kind of take for granted,
right.
as being kind of the go-to, stable notions are suddenly at risk. And so I have done a lot of work for this sort of 1-2 punch of putting myself in a situation where I am able to withstand a lot of the challenges of life, and then also constantly looking to sort of stretch myself, challenge myself, put myself into kind of uncomfortable situations with the goal of growing and having a bit of fun.
Yeah, you make resiliency look really interesting and fun and sexy.
Well, so this is actually a really good, if I may, a segue into an idea that I've been working on. And so WooStream gets the first look, if I may.
Hey, wow. All right, thanks.
So the idea is this: so there's a former bond trader turned scholar, this guy Nassim Taleb, and he's a bit of a curmudgeon, but he's a very smart guy. He wrote a series of books that I think are as important as ever. One is called Fooled by Randomness. The next one is called The Black Swan. What we're experiencing right now is a black swan. So a black swan is a out of the blue, unpredictable event of great gravity that can either be good or bad. Of course, we care more when they're bad than when they're good. That are just hard to predict, or they're very difficult to forecast, and so they just don't work very well in the typical kind of risk models that academics, finance people, et cetera, governments like to use. His most recent book is called, not most recent, but his next book is called Anti-Fragile. And in it, he makes this, I think, a very compelling argument, which is we can't predict the future, so stop trying. What you need to do is to take a look at the range of possible outcomes from good to bad, or actually from like incredibly good to incredibly bad, and assess what are your tolerance for those things. And so in the book, he puts forth these 3 categories of reactions, let's say, to bad things. So one is fragile, what he would call like the teacup, right? It can't handle shocks. The robust, the steel bar, and you might think of the robust as the phoenix, so to speak. right?
Okay.
Rising from the ashes as,
Mm-hmm.
as strong as it was before.
Mm-hmm.
And then, but in the book, as it's self-titled, he puts this idea forth about what he calls anti-fragility. And anti-fragility is fascinating. Is these are entities, these are organisms that react positively to chaos, to uncertainty, to tragedy, to calamity. This is, he calls it like the hydra. So you lop a head off the hydra and two grow back in its place.
Hmm.
Now, this is a fascinating concept, in part because so few things seem to be anti-fragile. But one of the things that I've recognized through my work, and we'll back our way back into it, is that comedians are surprisingly anti-fragile. That is, that when bad things happen, they get better.
Okay.
So Mitch Hedberg has this quote, which is like basically like, the more I F up, the better my career goes. And the idea is that the comics make jokes, not out of good things, they make jokes out of bad things. And so when things
Right.
go south, it gives them an opportunity to become better at what they do.
Right. And that goes all the way back to your work in the humor research lab, right? Where you were basically trying to figure out what's the formula for funny, and maybe just touch on that real quick.
Sure, yeah. So let's step back 10 years, and we'll return to this idea of comics being anti-fragile, because I think we can learn from them. That's
Okay.
the reason I bring this up.
Right.
But the work that I was doing, so I kind of was heading along this path that Eric was, he knows me well enough to say that when I say I'm going to do this, I usually do it. And so
Yeah.
I was living my assistant professor life at the University of Colorado, and I got invited to give a talk at another university. And so any academics who are watching will understand what that is. But basically, another university will invite you out. They'll pay for your airfare. They'll put you in a hotel. They'll give you a nice dinner, and you get to give a talk to the faculty, and then they basically poop on your idea for about an hour, right? And
That
so
sounds like fun.
it's an honor you get to put on your curriculum vitae. And so at the time, I was doing research on religious marketing, and I was looking at the bounds of religious marketing. Like, when do people think that a church has gone too far using business principles in order to save souls?
Mm-hmm.
And in this talk, I used a kind of provocative example of church marketing. This church in Tampa, Florida, that had used a raffle to try to get people to go to their winter retreat. And that seems, okay, I guess so. But what made it fascinating was their choice of grand prize, which was a yellow H2 Hummer SUV.
Wow.
So, yes, crazy. And so, in the same way that you're laughing, Eric, my audience laughed.
Mm-hmm.
A hand goes up in the back of the room, and a faculty member who had yet to poop on my idea asked me the most important question I've ever been asked. And it was, your talk says that religious marketing of this sort creates anger and outrage, and yet we're laughing. We're experiencing a positive emotion. Why is that? And I stood there dumbfounded. I said, I don't know. I flew back to Colorado. I realized, despite having studied emotions for more than 10 years, I had never read a paper about emotions. I didn't know what made things funny. And I knew that no one in my field was studying it.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, it's this incredibly important topic, right?
Right.
People pursue comedy in their entertainment choices. They pursue it in their friendships. They pursue it in their romantic relationships. It's something that we experience on a daily basis. There's evidence for it in the worst of worst situations, i.e. concentration camps. And, it's this thing that really is such an important part of the human condition, and yet sort of mainstream behavioral scientists were ignoring it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I recruited this very smart grad student, Caleb Warren, and I said, we should write a paper about this. And it started off very small. I just wanted to write a paper about why people laugh at moral violations.
Mm-hmm.
But we quickly figured that we need to answer a bigger question is what makes people laugh to begin with.
Right.
That's a question that goes back 2,500 years.
That's where this came from, right?
And yes, that's where that came from.
I love this book.
That's very nice of you. So that's where the humor research lab got launched, and I developed with Caleb this idea that humor arises from what we call benign violations, from things that are wrong yet okay, things that are threatening yet safe, things that don't make sense yet make sense. And for example, giving away a yellow H2 Hummer SUV seems wrong, but when the goal is to save souls, excuse me, now you get that wrong yet okay kind of thing. And so the work started getting some attention. I ended up connecting with this local journalist. He was writing an article about me. And one day he said, Pete, your theory seems pretty good. Why don't we go to an open mic and you can dissect the comedian's jokes, like tell us why they're working or why they're not working using your theory. So in this moment of hubris, I say, why don't I get on stage and tell some jokes? And the journalist, Joel Warner, says, that'd be great. And so with less than I don't think, maybe it was about a day of preparation, I ended up showing up at a seedy dive bar in Denver wearing a sweater vest and told a series of jokes that got 0 laughs. I didn't even get a laugh for wearing the sweater vest. I got a laugh, and one unintentional laugh. Basically, I did what happens at many open mics for the first timer. I completely bombed. And I mean, I would say this: like, I don't think of myself as a particularly funny person. By professorial standards, I'm hilarious, but by comedy standards, I'm not. And
so there's like dad jokes, professor jokes, and then there's like really funny people. And so
exactly,
you got the professor jokes down.
Indeed, yeah, I can crush it in a MBA class. So that experience ended up being a good one. As often is the case, bad things spur change, and this led me to make a decision that I needed to leave the laboratory in order to truly understand humor. And so I teamed up with that journalist. We went on this worldwide expedition. We ended up clowning with Patch Adams in the Amazon. We crossed over the border in Israel to Palestine to look at humor where you least expect it. Mm-hmm. We went to Japan to try to figure out those crazy Japanese game shows. And then at the end of the book, to prove that I've learned something, got on stage to do stand-up again, this time at the world's largest comedy festival. And so that was it. And it went slightly better.
Yeah, that's slightly. So you did learn something.
Yes.
You did learn something. But yeah, and so that's one thing that I can't help, selfishly wanting to weave into the conversation is that one of the other experiences that you and I have in common. We didn't share this experience, but we both went on semester at sea, and we've had conversations about that. But I thought that was a really interesting context for your book, was to also then travel the world. So you're looking at this multiculturally and not just what's funny in the United States or the context of US culture. So
yeah, I mean, I'm really thankful for semester at sea. So I went twice. I went when I was 26 and I went when I was 30. And international travel of that sort changed my life. I had a fairly provincial upbringing. Moving to California when I was 24 was like a big deal, and then going around the world a couple times in my late 20s, early 30s, just changes your perspective completely. And so the idea of going to Palestine may sound crazy to you, but after you've kind of been to a bunch of other places that sometimes can be a little dicey, you're just like, oh well, these are people living their lives too. You know what I mean? This is not something to be feared. This is something to be embraced. And frankly, that chapter was probably my favorite experience in the book. Mm-hmm. Going to a place that almost no American ever goes to.
Yeah, that is incredible. I mean, it gives me goosebumps to think about it and the way you describe it as you're going crossing the border and there's guys with machine guns and the concrete walls and the whole deal, and you were doing it. So it's really cool. Another thing, well, and bringing up semester C, you're probably one of the big reasons that I went was because you went before me, and I realized, just hearing of your experiences, it sounded incredible. Another friend who had also gone was Lisa, who you just interviewed in one of your most recent podcast episodes of Solo. So I can't wait to hear that interview. I'll get to hear the voices of two old friends at the same time. So speaking of Solo, maybe we should touch on that real quick and just that seems to me, as I've talked with you, a little bit of a surprise in terms of how successful that podcast has been. So maybe tell us a little bit about the premise. I mean, it's kind of geared towards people who aren't partnered, but as somebody who is very partnered, I've shared with you, outside this interview, that as the episodes I've listened to have been actually very important for me as well, in terms of whether it's life lessons in general, or even just a perspective on this kind of the dominant culture, that partnering is the default, and that maybe, being solo should be the default for a variety of reasons. But because of that, because the default being as it is, I think those of us who are partnered, or just society in general, places this expectation out there. And so
Mm.
that's, I think one of the important things from somebody who's in a long-term relationship, that there are ways that we can behave to be more inclusive and accommodating, and not just accepting, but supportive and celebratory of our solo friends, as I am of you.
You are indeed. So yeah, let me talk about that. So let's step back for a second, because this is how easy it is to have a podcast these days. I have two right now. So the first one is called I'm Not Joking, and it's a look at the lives of funny people. And as of tomorrow will be the 100th episode.
Hey,
And
congratulations.
thank you. And it might be the last episode. I don't know. Um, I started I'm Not Joking to seed ideas for this new book, to work on a new skill, which is listening and interviewing, which you're executing right now very nicely. Thank you. And then the normal kind of brand building type stuff. Like if you're an
Mm-hmm.
expert in comedy, then this is one way to demonstrate it. And it stretched me in a variety of ways. What's fascinating about the podcast was I never did it to build an audience.
Hmm.
So I did very little promotion of it. I would obviously tweet it out, put it on Facebook here and there every so often, but I mostly did it for the conversations and for the value of those conversations. At one point, I was planning doing what I call mini retirement, and I was going to take a year away from academia.
Mm-hmm.
This may sound crazy to people, that they would, well, like, don't let the beard fool you. I still feel like a relatively young man. That you would take a mini retirement as a as a as a 50-year-old. I was going to do it when I was turning 50, and but I knew that I was going to want to make stuff. I knew I was going to still want to keep writing, but I knew I wasn't going to write any academic papers, and so I hatched this idea. I was going to write a book about turning 50, and turning 50 well, so to speak.
There we go.
Yeah, and then I delayed. I ended up delaying the mini retirement, and I was like, well, no one wants to read a book about turning 52, And so as I was starting to look at my notes for the book, I realized the book wasn't about turning 50. It was about being a bachelor
Mm-hmm.
at 50 and doing it well.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I was like, well, what else can I do with this? And I had all these podcast skills, and I hatched this idea of what I call Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's essentially a positive view of single living. It's for the person who's unapologetically unattached.
Mm-hmm.
And you'd be surprised. There's a lot of us. The idea is that 28% of households in the United States are one person. They run the gamut from young to old and everything in between. These are people who are, single for now. They aspire to be married. They may be single forever. They've gone through a divorce. They don't ever want to do it again. Whatever it may be. And so I hatched this. This is my secret project for about a year. So anytime anybody asked me to do something that I didn't want to do, I just said, I can't do it. I'm working on my secret project. And
That's a
that's a
great
good
reason.
pro tip, by the
Yeah,
way.
it sure is.
Everybody should have a secret project. And so I launched it late in 2019. I've got about, 17, 18 episodes already. And it breaks between either remarkable single people and a glimpse into their world. People who are thriving, not despite the fact that they're single, but in part because they are, right? The premise is when you're unpartnered, you have time, energy, flexibility to often do things that you can't. For example, to just take off to the desert when there's a pandemic.
There you go.
And then the other one is experts. So talking to people who have particular skills. For example, in a recent episode, I talked to a psychiatrist and we address the question of how to find a therapist. And my argument is that solos should have a team and people that they can rely on. One of those teammates might be a therapist, and so we address the question, well, how the hell do you find one?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, we're in the kind of world where we're like, there's an app for that. For you, it's like there's a person for that. Like you really do have, and actually, like your barber, for example, like you do a solo episode with your barber, right? I mean, that's just neat how you have built that team of people who play these different roles in your life.
Yeah, and so I wanted this. I mean, solo in many ways sounds like it just comes out of nowhere. Like if you go to my webpage, it's everything about comedy and this book and all this kind of stuff. And then there's this one, it's all a different color and everything. Yeah. It just stands out as this other thing. And I have to admit, like, I still don't feel completely comfortable talking about it. Like my bachelorhood was always something that was kind of backstage. It doesn't show up in my first book. It doesn't show up in my second book. It's something that I would talk freely about to people I was close with, but it never was part of my identity as a public academic. And then I realized was that that was going to be an important thing for me to do because I think this message needs to get out. Like, so if you look at podcasts for single people, almost all of them are like, what's wrong with you? And how do we get you to not be single?
Right, or something about dating.
Exactly. And so I just felt compelled to do this because no one else was talking about it. And I had a hunch that there were enough people who had it as a problem, right? If you think about it, every Thanksgiving, there's someone at the table and there's like a well-meaning aunt or, grandfather or something who's just like, so when are you gonna, what's going, there's someone special in your life,
Right.
And I have people say to me, they're like, I love my job. I'm healthy. I volunteer. I travel the world. I've got great friends. I own a house. And people are like, yeah, but is there a special man in your life? Like, you need this thing to make it work. And by the way, I actually think for many people, being in a partnership is an outstanding thing. Like, I think it's great. I just think, exactly. I just think that it should be an option in the same way that dessert should be an option, right?
Yes.
In the same, right? Like, some people like to go to the beach for vacation and some people like to go to the desert. Like, there's not one right vacation in the world. Why should there be one style of partnership?
Right.
Now, I will say this, the reason that solo came about in part is because of hanging out with comedians all the time.
Oh, wow.
And because what happened is when you spend your time with comedians, as I tend to now, first of all, I find them more fascinating than academics.
Hey.
I know what academics are going to say. I don't always know what comedians are going to say.
All right.
the thing about comedians is they naturally take kind of an outsider's perspective on things. They take risks, you know, as you were saying about the book. They're kind of fearless. They live these authentic lives.
Mm-hmm.
And they do something which I talk about in my new book, which is they think in reverse. That is that, you know, what's called the reversal. This is like comedy 101.
Yeah, that's like the first chapter of the book, right?
It's the first chapter of the book. You know, it's a great way to create punchlines and create premises for comedy. So, you know, Henny Youngman, the king of the one-liner, says, "When I read about the dangers of drinking, I stopped
Reversed.
reading. I stopped reading."
Stop it.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
Missed it.
Missed it. You know, so the idea being, that you produce this opposing perspective, you end up getting laughs. Well, producing an opposing perspective is useful beyond just comedy. It can be useful in our own personal and professional lives. For example, if every podcast about being single is about how crap your life is, might there be something good that comes out of the reverse of that, which is how do you pursue a remarkable life in that way?
Mm-hmm.
And so thinking in reverse can provide new opportunities that you wouldn't normally. I mean, I think, for example, with the pandemic and people being sheltered in place, I think thinking in reverse can be useful, right? So you could say being sheltered in place is bad, and here's all the reasons why it's bad. Thinking in reverse says being sheltered in place is good, and here are the ways that being sheltered in place is good. And once you allow yourself to think that it can be good, I bet you can come up with 20 different reasons why this particularly unpleasant situation might actually be beneficial in both the near term and in the long term.
Right. Now, I think there is an interesting thing that's come up in solo, that single people, solo folks, are actually more connected in a lot of different ways, because whether it's your team or whether it's the fact that you just have a lot more of a social net. So maybe talk about that, and maybe talk about that in the context of our current shelter in place situation.
Sure, yeah, that'd be great. So I have a good friend. His name is Jeff Leitner. Jeff is a contributor to Shtick to Business, and we were on the phone recently, and he said, I looked at the acknowledgments, and I couldn't believe the number of people that were in your acknowledgments and who played a big role in the book. You know, so Jeff is married, happily married and has a daughter that he absolutely adores. And he's like, I talk to you on the phone a lot, Pete. And I didn't realize you must be on the phone all the time. And I was like, well, I don't think I talk on the phone any more than you do per se, but I just talk to lots of different people all of the time. And so, in episode 2 of Solo, called The Science of Single Living, I speak to Bella DiPaolo, a professor who studies these things. And she's done this research that shows that single people are actually more connected socially. And the reason is they don't have that one person who's supposed to be their everything.
Right.
And so they kind of, you know, they've got this friend for this and this family member for that and this friend for that, you know, and so on. And so you pick up the phone, text, make a lunch date with that person, depending on what the specific need that you have, whether it be entertainment, whether it be a shoulder to cry on, whether it be business advice, and so on. And so in many ways, like getting back to that fragility, robustness idea, is that being highly interconnected can actually help you be more robust, because when you only have one person that you can rely on, if that person goes down, if that person gets sick, if that person gets depressed, if that person, you know, is having their own set of problems, that puts you become the teacup in that situation. And so I think that there's something to be learned from singles, right? From the people who are used to living alone, who can be comfortable being sheltered in place to some degree, because they can reach out into this web as they need it
Hmm.
in that sense. And so they're kind of diversified socially in a way that, is kind of counterintuitive, I would say.
Right on.
Yeah.
That makes sense. But you're right. I think it is kind of counterintuitive, and folks would tend to take that for granted. But enough. We've danced around Shtick to business. You've woven it in. It's time to focus squarely on this
Sure.
masterpiece that launched just yesterday. And so part of the premise. Oh my gosh, he's disappeared. Hey,
I'm
he's
here.
back.
Yeah.
Part of the premise of this book is that as I think you say we're in the fourth industrial revolution, right? And so as the competition for humans in the workplace, we're up against non-human competition, and you distill it down to AI, essentially. I mean, you call it lots of different things. But some of the examples you give in the introduction are pretty fascinating. The I don't know what you call it, the computer program that can analyze a contract
Mm.
in less than 30 seconds and do it, with more accuracy than a top lawyer, I thought was one example of the ways that are a little bit mind blowing.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Like, right now we're experiencing a tremendous amount of economic upheaval, right? So millions of people have been thrown out of work, whether it be temporarily or perhaps permanently.
Right.
I think a lot of people, if they're not thinking about their career, they ought to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's fine to watch the Tiger King to get through some of this, but if you are not taking a really hard look at your professional life, your relationships, your health,
Mm-hmm.
like, you are asleep at the wheel. I think that this is a clear call to action.
So part of what you're saying is we're at this incredibly critical moment for most people in their lives due to what's going on, and your book actually can apply very directly to this moment, even though that's not why you wrote it
Yeah,
per
exactly.
se.
I didn't write. Yeah, so I wrote this book. So, we can lean on comedy in times of tragedy. That's fine. Like, having some delightful distraction is nice enough. But we can learn more from comics and the way they do their job,
Mm,
because the comic is anti-fragile, right? The comic is agile. The comic will never have his or her job taken away by a computer. And
mm-hmm.
that is because comedians trade in creativity.
Mm-hmm.
And so the jobs that are at risk are those non-essential jobs. The jobs that are at risk are any job that is rule-based, right? So if you're just following a script and you're following a formula, your job is going to go away,
Mm.
sooner or later, because that's what computers do very well.
Follow
Like,
the rules.
even jobs like call centers are starting to be replaced by robots, because people who work in call centers just typically follow the rules,
Mm-hmm.
right? When X happens, I do Y. When Y happens, I do Z, and so on. Reading a contract is just about enacting lawyerly rules. And so you program a computer to do it once, and then the computer always does it. And by the way, never's hungover, right? Never gets coronavirus. And
Mm-hmm.
so, the argument that I make is we should be seeking out career opportunities that rely on problem solving, that's not based on rules, that's based on creativity, that's based on
Mm-hmm.
originality.
Mm-hmm.
And so once you, and of course, the thing is, this is, we're suddenly thrown into a place where the normal rules don't apply anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that we can learn from comics because they have these particular practices and perspectives. I didn't write the book with the pandemic in mind, but I think that the book is more useful than ever
Right.
because we're living with chaos right now.
Right, completely relevant. So maybe highlight one or two other chapters in the
Sure.
book, besides the reversal. What are some of the other approaches that you recommend or discuss?
Yeah, so I think this one's especially useful for anyone who's sheltering at home with others, or anyone who's trying to work remotely, or even doing what we're doing right now. And that's so in chapter 4, I call it cooperate to innovate. And the idea is that the lone genius is largely a myth. that is like a single person can come up with a great idea, but it takes others in order to enact that. So the book
Mm-hmm.
is a perfect example of that. Like, yeah, I get the credit for it on the title, but not dozens of people, but 100 people were necessary to make that book happen. All my previous guests, people, editors, researchers, people who gave friendly feedback, people who did research before me that I called on, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And so what ends up happening is that we need to be able to get along with others if we're going to execute a creative idea. And so I think this kind of idea of yes and of improv has sort of been making its way through organizations. Like we've heard about yes and, we've heard about yes and.
Mm-hmm.
But improvisers have a whole menu of rules that they use to make a scene out of nothing. Like if you go to an improv show, nothing is rehearsed. Everything is happening in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it seems like you're watching a movie. It's incredible.
All right.
So I'll give you two examples of this that I like quite a lot. So the first one is listening. So I call it hear, right? So HEARHERE, right?
Okay.
So can you listen in the moment? And
Mm-hmm.
so in improv, for example, if you and I are creating a scene, you may be saying something, my mind is racing, right? I'm thinking about the next thing I'm going to say. I'm thinking about where the scene might go. I've got 100 things going on in my head. But at the same time, I need to be listening to you, because if you say we're on Mars
And you didn't catch that.
and I'm not listening to you, the next thing I'm talking about, we're at Disneyland. And now the audience is like, what? Look at these clowns, right? You know what I mean? And so
Not
the
in a good way.
ability, yes, the ability to listen. And to be honest, most people are really terrible at listening because they're spending too much time thinking about what they're going to say.
Right.
And so I have a workbook that you can download that has some different exercises to this. But one of the exercises is just this. It's like respond first to the last thing that someone says. Because that will guarantee that you're going to listen till the end.
Okay.
Another idea in improv that I like a lot, and I think is more important than ever, especially if you're stuck at home, is this idea that it comes from Del Close, who is one of the fathers of improv, that we are all supporting actors, right? So if you go to an improv show, there's usually someone who just seems like a genius, a comedic genius. There's just like, oh my God, that person is so good. I've been living in Los Angeles. Down the street from me is Upright Citizens Brigade, the theater. I probably go to a show once a week, once every 2 weeks. And there's certain shows I go to over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that comedic genius changes from week to week.
Oh, wow.
It's like, and the reason is because everybody in that scene is working to make everyone else look good.
Okay.
And then every so often someone rises up and is the star of the show.
Mm-hmm.
But they're only the star because everybody's supporting them to allow them to step into it. And so I like the idea that if all of us approach this as we're all supporting actors, I'm here to help you first, you're here to help me first, then it allows us to, kind of the rising tide lifting all boats, so to speak.
Awesome. That makes a lot of sense. Are there other things? I think we're starting to get towards the end of our time. Are there other takeaways you want this audience to hear about your book?
Sure. So the idea behind the book is not to be funny. That's too much pressure, and there's too many challenges with trying to be funny, especially in the workplace. I say leave it to the professionals, but I like this idea of thinking funny. That is to think differently. So one of my early readers of the book, she sent me a text. She said, I've read 200 business books. She's a CMO of a prominent company. And she said, I've never read a business book that talks about writing.
Oh.
So I have a chapter in the book called Write It or Regret It. And the idea behind it is that a microphone is not the most important tool in comedy. It's a notepad. It's a notebook. And so this is a ubiquitous element for comics. They constantly carry around a notebook where they're just noting things that they see. They're writing down their thoughts. They're workshopping jokes. It's just something that they always have with them. So Mitch Hedberg, who I referred to earlier, his wife said that she only once ever saw him cry, and it's when he lost his notebook.
Oh my gosh.
Right. That's how important it is. So I'm encouraging people, and this is not easy advice to enact. I encourage people to start a writing practice.
Well, you do that every day, right? Every morning?
I write every morning, and then I've recently, because of the book, I've started journaling.
Okay.
And so I think this is an outstanding time to start journaling. To start to record your thoughts, record what you're thinking, what you're feeling, what's happening. Use that. But there's something nice about a pen on paper that slows down your thinking. There's something about that feel that I like a lot. You don't have to do it on paper, but I encourage people to do that. I think that becomes a place you can write about what you're struggling with. I think it's a great place to write what you're feeling grateful for. So there's behavioral research on the value of gratitude. At the end of the day, you write down 3 things that went well and why. Can have a very positive effect. And you'd be surprised how many good things go down during a day that you easily gloss over because you're focused on those negative things. I also think that this is a good time to just get really honest with yourself about what's going well, what's not going well, what are you good at, what are you bad at, what do you want your second life to look like, to get back to that Confucius idea. And I prescribe writing as a way to do that. It's a good skill to develop in terms of capturing those ideas. That you can look back on this 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, with some perspective, and then it becomes a good tool for clarifying. What is it that you want and how might you get there? What kind of changes that you want? Otherwise, it just gets easy to just slip back into normal life when things get to be normal again.
Right, and trying to live the way we were living on the other side of this is probably going to be more difficult.
I think that's a mistake.
Right on.
I think the issue is that if you're feeling fragile right now, and you go back to the way you were doing things before, the way you spend money, the way you save money, the way you earn money, the way you develop and maintain relationships, the way you take care of your mind, body, and soul. If you go back to the way you're doing that, you're going to be just as fragile when the next black swan comes along. And so I think while few of us will ever get to be anti-fragile, to be the Hydra, at the very least, let's become the Phoenix, right? Let's become the steel bar that bends but doesn't break.
Right. Well said. Well said, my friend. Well, that feels like a pretty good.
Yeah, I can't tap that. I can't
right?
top that.
That's a mic drop right there, I think. So how about we wind down? I don't know if you have any other closing thoughts, but I just want to say thanks. I really appreciate your time. I know how busy you are trying to get this book launch out, and I'm sure you've got a stack of other interviews and other kinds of engagements that you need to attend to. And so it means a lot to me that you took time to let us put you out there on WooStream.
Well, I would have called you anyways, so we might as well have done it this way.
It's fantastic. It's fantastic. I really appreciate it. So thanks very much, Pete, for spending time with us today. This was as fascinating conversation as I had expected and hoped for. Also, thanks to our viewers. If you enjoyed this presentation, stay tuned as we'll be adding new content weekly. Please also share your feedback with us and send suggestions for additional content to alumni@willamette.edu. All right,
Damn it.
There we go. Willamette, damn it. Well, thanks again, Dr. McGraw. Time spent with you is a treasure as always.
You're too kind. Thank you, Eric.
All right.
Cheers.
Cheers.